The man in front of him sat staring into the distance. When he saw a strange figure blending in with the crowd, like someone in a delirious state, that figure became increasingly bizarre, clearer and clearer, making him afraid. It was the haunting presence that had always followed the man since he was a child. At a different time, Theodora, the man's older sister, appeared at the beginning of the video. Since childhood, she always wore a glove, not because she was obsessed with cleanliness, but because Theodora had a special ability. Just by touching anything, she could sense its past. However, this ability had caused Theodora quite a bit of trouble. Once, Theodora's father, Hugh, was rummaging through things and handed her a wooden box. As soon as she touched it, she realized there was something valuable inside. Hugh opened the box and indeed discovered a bottle of wine from 1982. On another occasion, while the children were playing, Luke found a speaker in the dining hall. Following the trail of the speaker, Theodora led Luke up to the upstairs bedroom. It turned out to be a sound transmission tube. When Theodora leaned against the edge of the bed, she could sense that someone sick had once lain there, and the sound tube was the only way for the patient to communicate. Additionally, Theodora could also sense the emotions of others through touch. That time, Luke was mischievously playing in the kitchen, causing the latter to become a mess. The housekeeper noticed and immediately became furious. She scolded the two children for causing trouble in the kitchen, then led them outside. However, when the housekeeper touched Theodora, she realized that the housekeeper was not angry but rather terrified. From then on, strange events began happening in the house. One day, Theodora was in her room, watching TV and playing, when suddenly the door handle was twisted by someone. When Theodora bent down to look through the crack in the door, she saw no one there. A few days later, Luke, curious as always, wanted to use the elevator to go up to the second floor. To indulge her younger brother, Theodora pressed the button, and the elevator began to descend. When it reached the basement, Luke discovered a hidden cellar that the family had no idea existed. Inside, it was filled with dust, and it was clear that the cellar had been abandoned for a long time. Under the light of the flashlight, a corner of the cellar revealed an arm, and a monster was charging towards Luke. His screams made Theodora's parents rush to the scene, and her father quickly brought the elevator back up. Fortunately, Luke was only left with torn clothes and no serious injuries. But when Luke described the monster, his parents didn't believe him. They thought he was just rambling due to his fear. However, when Theodora touched Luke, she realized he wasn't lying. To investigate further, Theodora followed the path Luke indicated and found the entrance to the cellar, but this time she didn't see any monsters. Instead, in a locked room, Theodora found some accounting books. After she showed her mother Olivia, everyone realized that the basement was actually a wine cellar. Since making alcohol was illegal at the time, the cellar had been hidden in the house's architectural plans. But when Olivia reached out to comfort Theodora, a strange sensation suddenly overwhelmed her, causing Theodora to scream. This made Olivia realize that Theodora had inherited her ability to sense things. The next day, Olivia gave her daughter a pair of gloves and carefully instructed her not to let anyone know about this gift. From then on, Theodora always wore gloves in her daily life. With her special ability, she became a psychologist. One day, Theodora received a consultation case for an autistic girl. Through the girl's story, Theodora learned that in the basement of the girl's house, there was an uncle with a smiling face living there. Those words made Theodora, while sleeping, suddenly wake up, feeling as though someone had pulled her blanket. When she looked up, she saw the smiling uncle that the autistic girl had described. The sight terrified Theodora, and she couldn't fall asleep again, so she went out to drink. By chance, she met Shirley, who was looking for Theodora. From Shirley's words, she learned about the death of her youngest sister, Nell. This news was a huge shock to Theodora. When Nell's body was brought home, Theodora couldn't bring herself to face it. She made an excuse to go to the doctor and left the scene. Theodora then went to the autistic girl's house last time before. With the consent of the girl's parents, Theodora went down to the basement to investigate. Although she had touched almost everything, she found no clues, until Theodora touched the sofa. A sharp pain suddenly overwhelmed her mind. She could feel everything that the autistic girl had suffered. She finally noticed that on the ceiling, there was an image resembling a human face. It turned out to be the smiling uncle that the autistic girl had mentioned. After realizing the truth, Theodora sat in the car and called the police. Soon after, the police arrived and arrested the girl's stepfather. It turned out that the stepfather had been abusing the girl for a long time. To escape the pain and despair, the autistic girl had imagined the image on the ceiling as the smiling uncle. But even after saving the girl, Theodora didn't feel relieved. Instead, she blamed herself for not saving Nell. To understand the cause of her younger sister's death, Theodora gathered all her courage to return to the morgue and look at Nell's body. Theodora removed her gloves and gently touched Nell's forehead. But in the next moment, Theodora seemed to see something horrifying. She was in shock and alone. She sat outside drinking to numb the pain. At that moment, her brother-in-law passed by and tried to comfort her, but unexpectedly, Theodora quickly exposed him. She told him that Shirley had discovered his secret savings account and urged him to find an excuse for his affair. It turned out that not long before, Shirley had found a strange bank statement in her husband's bag and suspected he was hiding money for an affair. However, since there was no clear evidence, Shirley had only shared this with Theodora. Of course, Theodora's words indicated that she had known about the savings account for a long time, but it was likely that she knew of an even worse secret than the affair. Going back to the past, Luke was hiding under the bed. He tried to stay silent and hold his breath. Suddenly, the door to the room slowly opened, and a pair of feet that didn't touch the ground entered the room. The shadow looked around and took the hat, but just as the shadow was about to leave, Luke accidentally made a noise, and the feet stopped, then moved toward him. From that moment on, Luke was psychologically haunted. However, no one in the house believed what he had said. This caused Luke to fall into despair and gradually become withdrawn. To escape his fear, Luke became an addict. His siblings didn't want to watch him spiral down, so they took him to a rehabilitation center. When Luke first arrived, he was rebellious and only thought about escaping the rehab center. Fortunately, he later met a girl named Joey. The two encouraged each other and eventually managed to complete 90 days of rehab. However, one night, Luke suddenly woke up from a nightmare. As he sat up, he noticed his younger sister Nell standing by the window and telling him to leave, but he didn't pay much attention to it. The next morning, Luke heard from the counselor that Joey had escaped from the rehab center and left a note on the table telling him not to look for her. It seemed that Joey hadn't been able to succeed in her rehab, but Luke ignored the note and decided to help Joey return to the center. As he stepped outside, Luke remembered the dream from the night before and called Nell to learn more, but no one answered. As he was confused and didn't know what to do, a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat came into Luke's sight. The fear immediately brought him back to old memories. When he was a child, Luke would often see strange creatures, but no one in the family believed him. Feeling helpless, Luke confided his secret to his close friend. To his surprise, the friend in the blue outfit that Luke often talked to was someone the family had never seen. One day, while the family was cleaning up, Luke's mother gave her two children a box of buttons and a hat. The two children received the gifts and began playing in the villa's yard. Nell took the buttons upstairs and told Luke to wait by the sound tube, as she would drop 3 buttons down through the tube. But when the buttons fell to the first floor, there were only 2 buttons. When they thought the third button had gotten stuck, it slowly rolled out of the hole. A hoarse voice then came from the sound tube, calling the housekeeper's name. The 2 children thought there was someone upstairs. Immediately, Luke went upstairs to check but found the room empty. As Luke was reporting to his youngest sister through the sound tube, the strange voice called again, and a ghostly face reflected in the tube, which terrified Luke. In a panic, he quickly ran out of the room. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. In the middle of the night, Luke was awakened by the sound of a dog barking. He quietly opened the door to check and was shocked to see a 3-meter-tall giant in the hallway. Terrified, Luke crawled under the bed. Not long after, the giant, carrying a staff, entered the room. At that moment, Luke saw clearly that the giant's feet didn't touch the key ground. After rummaging through the room, the giant grabbed the hat that Luke had received from his mother earlier that morning. It was clear that the hat belonged to the giant, and this ghostly figure was the one that had been haunting and causing Luke's severe psychological torment. Today, when Luke saw the giant again, he felt extreme fear. He didn't dare to stop for long and could only continue searching for Joey's whereabouts. Luke found her in a square, and he quickly called the rehab center, hoping they would come to pick both of them up and take them back. But the director of the center refused the request, saying that anyone who ran away would be considered to have given up on rehab. It was clear that the center no longer accepted Joey. With no other options, Luke went to Steven's house to ask for help. However, when he arrived, he learned that his brother and sister-in-law had been separated for a month. This surprised him, and Luke had to ask his sister-in-law for Steven's address. But when he entered the house, he found out that Steven wasn't home, since Luke and Joey had no money, and he needed to find a place for Joey to stay. Luke decided to take a few items from Steven's house to sell for money, but as he stepped out the door, he encountered Steven returning home. Steven thought his younger brother still hadn't shaken off his bad habits and handed Luke $200, demanding that he return the notebook. Not knowing how to explain it to his brother, Luke could only take the money and leave. Later, Luke told Joey about the money he had received. Now, neither of them would have to wander the streets anymore. Upon hearing the news, Joey was overjoyed. She unexpectedly hugged Luke and kissed him on the cheek, then said she needed to go to the bathroom for a moment. But Luke waited and waited, and Joey never returned. At that moment, he realized that the money in his pocket had vanished. Luke had no money left, so he had to sleep on the street. However, throughout the night, he kept seeing the figure of a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat, and the figure kept getting closer and closer. Unable to bear the fear, Luke decided to call the rehab center again. At that moment, Steven also arrived at the center. After learning about his younger brother's condition, he, along with the center's director, decided to go pick up Luke. Meanwhile, the man with the hat appeared again. Sensing something was off, Luke finally gathered the courage to turn around and face the apparition. But when he turned, he only saw their mother, Oliva, with her eyes wide open, emitting a blinding light. When Luke woke up, he found Steven had driven there, and he immediately ran to hug his brother. On the way back, Steven informed Luke about the heartbreaking incident involving their youngest sister, Nell. However, upon hearing the news, Luke firmly denied it, saying it was not a suicide. It turned out that Luke was the only one who knew that Nell could see the crooked neck woman. Clearly, Nell's condition was very similar to Luke's, and something must have happened that led to Nell's death. Before her eyes appeared the image of the girl who had been dancing just a moment ago in the brightly lit mansion mansion with her lover, but the next second, she was found mysteriously hanged in the abandoned house. The story returned to Nell's narrative. Among the 7 family members, she was the first to notice the strange occurrences in the house. On the very first day of moving in, Nell saw a twisted woman standing at the head of her bed. This terrified Nell so much that she couldn't sleep in her room. Olivia had to sleep with her on the sofa, but as soon as Nell's mother left, she woke up again and was horrified to see the twisted woman hovering above her head. As she grew older, Nell developed serious psychological issues. She had to take medication in order to sleep. Through Stephen's introduction, she began psychological treatment. Over time, Nell and Dr. Arthur developed feelings for each other, and before long, they married with the family's blessing. Under Arthur's dedicated care, Nell gradually began to forget her delusions. However, a few months later, she had another episode. Arthur discovered that his wife was breathing heavily. He immediately sat up to comfort her and prepared to turn on the light to help Nell calm down. But as Arthur stood up, he suddenly convulsed and collapsed onto the floor. The twisted woman appeared right beside him. Nell couldn't move. She could only open her eyes and watch her husband pass away. This shock completely shattered Nell, as she had just lost her only emotional support. Although the doctor diagnosed that Arthur had died from a stroke, Nell didn't believe it. The doctor also found the situation strange and saw Nell's condition worsening. He advised her that, in order to cure her illness, Nell needed to return to the old house and face the fear that had haunted her for so long. The doctor's advice reminded Nell of something from her childhood. Once when she was still in the mansion, the wall had been torn by someone. On that wall was a line of writing. Her name, Nell. Olivia thought it was just a prank by the youngest daughter and scolded Nell harshly. But only Theodora knew that the youngest daughter hadn't done it. When their mother left, Theodora came and touched the wall, confirming that this wasn't Nell's doing. Curious, Theodora tore off another piece of wallpaper, and suddenly another line of writing appeared. This made Nell suspect that everything was fate. Something was guiding her back to the past. Nell decided to tell her siblings about this, but she didn't expect anyone to pay attention to her words. Luke ran to see Nell only to ask for money to buy drugs one last time before going to rehab, which deeply saddened her. While Luke was injecting drugs in the car, Nell, in a clear state of mind, saw the crooked neck woman. The image was so vivid and clear that it terrified her. Nell thought these visions were caused by the medicine, so when she got home, she flushed all the medication the doctor had prescribed down the toilet. Later, Nell went to see Theodora, but Theodora acted indifferently, even scolding Nell for buying illegal substances for Luke. The indifference of her family caused Nell to completely collapse. In the end, she followed the doctor's advice. One night, Nell hurriedly returned to the old house, the one her father had once moved the whole family into. Before that, Nell had dreamed a nightmare. Unlike her usual dreams, this time, she saw Luke dead on the floor. Fearing something had happened to Luke, she woke up and immediately called her brother Stephen and the others. But everyone was busy with work and hung up without answering. Unable to get in touch, Nell went out to the hallway to buy some water. As she was about to return, the hallway light began to flicker. The next moment, Nell was once again terrified. With all the strange events happening recently, she became more convinced that she needed to return to the old house. Without hesitation, Nell drove back to the mansion. Before leaving, she made a final phone call to her father, Hugh. After explaining the situation to him, Nell immediately entered the abandoned mansion. The strange thing was that the mansion, which had been abandoned, was now lit up. Upon entering the hall, she saw her siblings as they were when they were children. Everyone was waiting to welcome Nell back. Her mother had even written a greeting to her on the wall. Lost in a hallucination, Nell was led by her mother to change into a dress. When she returned to the hall, the family had changed their appearance. Among the crowd, there was even the figure of her husband, Arthur. This deeply moved Nell, as she had never felt so happy. To the sound of soothing music, Nell and her husband danced a romantic waltz. But it was all just a hallucination. In reality, Nell was dancing alone in the cold, old house, with cobwebs and dust covering everything. When the music ended, Arthur suddenly disappeared, and Olivia appeared again. Her mother called Nell upstairs to go to bed. Upon reaching the room, Olivia handed her a pendant. Nell was overjoyed and put it around her neck. But as she smiled happily, everything suddenly changed completely. At that moment, Nell found herself standing outside on the stairs, and the necklace around her neck had turned into a noose. Immediately after, her mother kissed her on the forehead, and Nell was pushed forcefully downward. She began to fall freely, and as her consciousness slowly faded, scenes started to appear before her eyes. The first was the image of Nell and Luke sitting in the car. Then came the scene of Arthur's death, followed by the image of her childhood on the sofa. It was then that Nell realized the twisted woman was actually her after death. At her own funeral, the entire family gathered. No one could accept the loss of their youngest daughter. Stephen, who didn't believe in the supernatural, even began to see hallucinations. He saw Olivia, who had passed away, standing next to his younger sister's coffin. Stephen thought it was just his grief causing him to hallucinate. However, when he looked back again, he noticed his mother was standing closer. He had to suppress his fear and return to the hall. Finally, their father arrived. He looked at his children, and, for a moment, Hugh seemed to see them as they were when they were little. After greeting everyone, he approached his youngest daughter's body. Hugh expressed his sorrow and longing for his daughter, but no one noticed that Nell's ghost was standing standing in the corner of the room. Everyone began recounting the incident of the youngest daughter's death, each making excuses for why they hadn't answered Nell's calls. Only Hugh mentioned that he had received a call from his youngest daughter that night. She had said that the twisted woman had appeared again. This made Stephen very angry, believing that Nell's mental illness had relapsed, but his father had ignored it. If Hugh had intervened in time, the tragedy might have been prevented. Stephen wondered why, whenever something happened, Hugh always tried to hide something. Just like when Olivia passed away, he hadn't disclosed the cause of her death. Before Hugh could explain, Shirley, who was beside him, couldn't take it anymore and began blaming Stephen for his actions. She accused her brother of thinking that both their mother and youngest sister had mental illnesses and of using their family tragedy to write a horror novel for money. To Shirley, this felt like rubbing salt into the family's wounds. As soon as she finished speaking, no one in the family could remain calm. Theodora immediately joined the argument, stating that Shirley was making a big deal out of nothing. Theodora believed this was just part of Stephen's work. If it weren't for Stephen, their family wouldn't know how much they would have suffered. Theodora openly admitted that she had received money from Stephen's book sales. Hearing this, Shirley became incredibly angry and wanted to throw her younger sister out of the house. However, Shirley's husband disagreed. He admitted that he too had received money from Stephen. It turned out that Shirley's funeral business was becoming increasingly difficult, and she often did charity work on a whim. This left Shirley's family struggling to make ends meet. If it weren't for Stephen's help, they probably wouldn't have been able to survive. The personal account Shirley had discovered was from her brother's royalties, which is why Theodora advised her brother-in-law to use the affair to cover it up. These words were clearly too much for Shirley to bear. She began crying and walked over to her youngest sister's coffin. But then, Shirley noticed that someone had placed 2 buttons on the body. At the same time, the lights in the room suddenly went out, and everyone had to check what was happening. When they heard thunder outside, their father began to drift into his memories. It turned out that a similar incident had happened in the mansion before. A storm had caused a power and water outage, and the whole family had to gather together, preparing to use flashlights to check things. But as soon as they inserted the batteries into the flashlights, they realized that their youngest daughter, who was always nearby, had mysteriously disappeared. Nell's parents quickly split up to search for her. Along the way, Hugh's flashlight suddenly went out. They had to separate. Hugh went to replace the batteries, while Olivia continued searching for their daughter. However, she didn't realize that an old woman was sitting on a nearby bed. Soon after, Olivia heard the sound of a doorknob turning in a room. When she opened the door, she discovered a boy sitting in a wheelchair inside. When Hugh finished replacing the batteries and returned to look for his wife, he found the flashlight lying on the floor, but Olivia had vanished without a trace. As Hugh continued searching everywhere, he saw the shadow of his wife appear. He intended to call out to her, but as soon as he spoke, the window suddenly shattered. Then Olivia reappeared in her previous spot, but she seemed to have no memory of what had happened. At that moment, the children's screams echoed from downstairs. The children frantically said they had seen a large dog. When Hugh was about to go into the kitchen to check, he heard Nell's voice. Suddenly, the power was restored. Everyone anxiously asked where Nell had gone, but the youngest daughter only replied that she had always been there, but it seemed that no one could see her. As the memory ended, Hugh stood next to Nell's body. He suddenly saw his daughter's figure standing in the hallway, but just as quickly, the figure disappeared. When everyone returned to the funeral home, Luke asked about the cause of his youngest sister's death, as he believed that Nell's death was not simple. Upon hearing this, Stephen became angry and asserted that both their mother and younger sister had mental illnesses. He criticized the family for always believing in supernatural matters. At that moment, their father, who had been suppressing his feelings for so long, finally spoke out, scolding Stephen. He insisted that no one in the family had a history of mental illness. Hugh mentioned that he hadn't brought up Olivia's death because the whole family had been affected by the old mansion, but as the two were arguing fiercely, Nell's coffin suddenly collapsed. Immediately after, the electricity was restored. This made Shirley feel heartbroken, and she used the excuse of going to get her makeup box to adjust her sister's appearance. However, when she entered the storage room, Shirley saw Theodora and her husband secretly inside. She discovered what was going on, but pretended not to see it. Instead, Shirley quietly turned away. Meanwhile, in the lobby, before leaving, Luke glanced back at Nell's coffin, recalling the promise he had made to his younger sister long ago. Luke had sworn to protect her, but now they had been separated by 2 different worlds. Nell's ghost appeared once again, but no one could see her. After the heavy storm, the century-old mansion showed signs of the walls becoming dangerously soft. Hugh suspected that cause was broken pipes in the walls, leading to dampness. Following the damp walls down to the basement, Hugh discovered a wall that was severely damaged. When he drilled a small hole in the wall, he found that there was another wall inside. Through the image he took, Hugh noticed that the surface of the wall was covered with mold. This puzzled him greatly, as this type of mold could only grow in places where decomposing corpses were present. How could it appear on the walls of a house? To clarify the matter, Hugh called a worker to try drilling through the outer wall. However, when reviewing the blueprints, he realized that his wife had made changes to the house's design. This made Hugh very angry angry. He confronted his wife, but Olivia insisted that she had only copied the old blueprint and didn't understand why the design had changed. This made Hugh increasingly suspicious that there was something strange about the house. Ever since they moved into the mansion, Olivia's mental state had not been right. She had not only become easily distracted when working, but also frequently sleepwalked at night. There was even one time when she held a chisel to his throat. Hugh began to feel terrified as his wife grew more unstable. The gardener advised him to quickly take his wife out of the old house, as his mother had once worked in the mansion. Over time, her mental state had begun to deteriorate as well. Later, he took over his mother's job and became the gardener of the mansion. He then married a maid who worked there. However, when the maid became pregnant, it coincided with Mrs. Poppy, the former owner of the mansion, falling ill. This caused the maid to overwork, resulting in a miscarriage. From that point on, the maid began to have mental issues. She often said that she could hear the crying of a baby. At first, the gardener thought it was just her imagination. One day, the gardener heard the sound in the room as well, and he became certain that everything was real. From that point on, they never stayed overnight in the mansion again. Following the gardener's advice, Hugh decided to take his wife to stay at her cousin's house for a few days, while he stayed behind to continue repairing the basement. As he drilled through the moldy wall, Hugh was horrified to discover a skeleton inside. The skeleton was holding a trowel. The police quickly arrived at the scene. After investigating, they found that the skeleton belonged to the former owner of the mansion, Mr. William. Since his mysterious disappearance, no one had seen him again. It turned out that William had locked himself inside the wall. However, they also found scratch marks on the inside of the wall. But if he wanted to escape, why would he have locked himself in there in the first place? Clearly, there was still something mysterious about the mansion. Back in the present, Nell's funeral went ahead as planned. Friends and family came to attend. As Luke knelt by the grave to scatter dirt, he looked up and saw his youngest sister staring at him. Before Luke could determine if it was real or just a hallucination, a hand suddenly reached out from the grave and pulled him in. The person was Olivia, now deceased. As Luke struggled, Stephen noticed in time and pulled him out of danger. Stephen realized his brother was once again seeing hallucinations. He thought Luke couldn't handle the shock and that his mental state had been affected. Stephen immediately comforted Luke, urging him to stay strong and learn to face the pain, so that he wouldn't follow in the footsteps of their mother and younger sister, who had chosen to end their lives. After the funeral, the family, already strained, became even more distant, and no one said another word. But as everyone was preparing to leave, Shirley discovered that her purse had been rummaged through by someone. The car keys and several items had disappeared. Seeing this, Hugh spoke up to Shirley, telling her that he had seen Luke touch her purse. This made Shirley very angry. She thought that Luke couldn't handle the pressure and had relapsed into addiction. While everyone went off to search for Luke, Theodora stayed behind and discovered that on the carpet, which had been clean, mold stains had appeared out of nowhere. She traced the mold to Shirley's room. Upon entering, she found the models her mother had once scattered all over the place. Theodora bent down to pick them up, but to her surprise, something was crawling in the dark corner, causing her to scream loudly. As soon as Hugh heard the scream, he rushed over and hugged Theodora. When she looked up, the ghost she had seen earlier had vanished. Hearing the noise, Shirley quickly ran over, but all she saw were the scattered pieces of the model. When she asked her father what had happened, Hugh remained silent. To find Luke quickly, Stephen decided to drive around the streets with his father. In the car, the father, who had always been silent, finally spoke up and asked about Stephen's separation. However, Stephen criticized his father, accusing him of being fake in his concern, as Hugh had never cared about Stephen before. Now, he was pretending to show interest. He candidly explained that, believing the family had a history of mental illness, he had decided to undergo a vasectomy right after graduating from college. This had caused a conflict with his wife. It turned out that since he was a child, Stephen had noticed his mother showing abnormal signs. At that time, Hugh, following the gardener's advice, decided to take Olivia to stay at her cousin's house for a few days. He asked Stephen to stay behind and take care of his siblings, which he agreed to do, and he went to find his younger siblings. On his way, Stephen saw many workers busy with repairs. That was when he realized his father didn't intend to sell the old house. He had decided to renovate it so the whole family could live together. When Stephen arrived at the door of his siblings' room, he saw his mother standing there, muttering to herself. Her strange behavior made Stephen feel uneasy. While playing a game in the entertainment room, he happened to notice an old vanity table. Stephen decided to restore it and give it to his mother as a gift. He went to the maid to ask for help with painting and restoring the table. After inspecting it, the maid told Stephen the origin of the vanity. It turned out that it belonged to the former owner of the mansion, Mrs. Poppy. She had often exhibited strange behavior, so after Poppy passed away, all of her belongings had been sealed. Stephen then painted the table and even carefully placed a family photo on it. Olivia was very happy when she received the gift from her son, but as she sat down in front of the vanity, Olivia's expression gradually changed. The strange behavior in the family led Stephen to believe that there was something wrong with the family's genes. However, when Hugh heard this, his expression became increasingly strange. He was about to explain when the phone suddenly rang. On the other side, Shirley was cleaning up the house after everyone had left. Suddenly, there was a knock knock at the door. When she opened it, she found no one outside. But when Shirley closed the door, the frightening knock came again. She thought it was just a prank by the kids and rushed outside to scold them. But to her surprise, there were no children, only Theodora was approaching. It turned out that Theodora had come to explain the incident where she had hugged her brother-in-law in the storage room the other day. Theodora said that it was too dark, so she couldn't tell who the person was. However, Shirley only believed in what she had seen. This led to another argument between the two. As Shirley grabbed Theodora's hand and tried to make her leave, the knock came again. This time, the knock made them stand still, too frightened to move. Luckily, at that moment, Shirley's phone rang. It was a call from the bank, informing her that her credit card had been used at a gas station. The gas station was on the road to Hill Mansion. She immediately called Stephen. The two of them went to the gas station, where the staff confirmed that Luke had used the card and even bought several cans of gasoline. Upon hearing this, Hugh could no longer sit still. He hurriedly urged Stephen to go to Hill Mansion. Hugh also instructed Shirley and Theodora to stay inside and not go outside. On their way, Hugh finally spoke up and explained about the mansion. He told Stephen that the house was very dangerous. It always found ways to manipulate those who lived inside. Anyone who died in the mansion would have their soul trapped there forever. Hugh mentioned that he had read Stephen's book, where Stephen had described seeing many workers and repairmen fixing a broken clock. But in reality, Hugh had never hired anyone to fix the house that much. That clock had never even been touched. Not only that, but the descriptions in the book about the entertainment room and the cabin in the woods didn't exist. Stephen's family had only lived there for 2 months, so there was no time to build those things. Upon hearing this, Stephen was completely confused. Clearly, these were memories he had witnessed with his own eyes. But Hugh just shook his head and told him to check for himself at the mansion. Hugh explained that the reason he had remained silent and kept the truth hidden was to protect everyone and keep them away from the mansion. However, it seemed that the mansion had never let go of their family. Meanwhile, Shirley and Theodora, who were at home, did not listen to Hugh's advice. They drove toward the mansion. On the way, the two of them began arguing again. But soon after, a sudden wave of terror overwhelmed them, causing Theodora to leap out of the car and sit on the side of the road, crying uncontrollably. Finally, she explained the misunderstanding that had occurred that day to Shirley. When Theodora had touched the body of the younger sister, she just wanted to know what had happened. But after that, Theodora lost her special ability. This made her feel suffocated. Therefore, on the night she kept vigil over the deceased, Theodora drank a lot of alcohol. The power went out at that moment, which terrified her to the extreme, and coincidentally, her brother-in-law appeared. So, Theodora leaned on him. After hearing Theodora's confession, Shirley finally chose to trust her, and their relationship was mended. In another turn of events, Luke drove up to the gate of the mansion. As soon as he arrived, the red lights illuminated the mansion. Upon entering the main hall, Luke poured gasoline on the floor and set it on fire. However, the blue flames quickly extinguished. On the staircase, Luke's mother appeared in a red dress. She reached out her hand toward Luke, and as he focused on her, he didn't realize that another woman was slowly approaching him from behind. When Hugh's family moved into the mansion, they were completely unaware of the mysterious nature of the old house. It wasn't until Olivia started having psychological problems, frequently suffering from severe headaches. One day, Olivia was sitting in the study, drinking tea. When the headache returned, she went into the kitchen to take some medicine and found her children arguing. After calming them down, Olivia told her children that she would return to the study to rest. However, Olivia's words confused the children greatly. It turned out that in their memories, there had never been a study room in the mansion. When Olivia returned to the study, she was shocked to find an unfamiliar scene in front of her. Olivia was standing in the embalming room, and the body on the table was her youngest daughter, Nell. Staring at the corpse before her, she seemed unable to believe it. As Olivia stepped back, she accidentally tripped over something at her feet. Looking down, Olivia was horrified to see that Luke was also lying dead on the floor. Nell's body behind suddenly sat up in a strange manner. She tried to say something, but couldn't open her mouth, until Nell used scissors to pry open her mouth and called Olivia mother. Olivia was so shocked that she collapsed to the floor. The embalming room scene suddenly transformed back into the study. In this bizarre situation, Olivia was left in a state of shock. That evening, before going to bed, she told her husband about the events of the day. She also mentioned that her headaches were becoming more severe. After hearing this, Hugh wasn't overly concerned. He thought his wife was simply exhausted and that rest would make her feel better. In the middle of the night, Olivia woke up and noticed a shadowy figure pass by the door. She immediately sat up to check, but found nothing in the hallway. When she turned back, Olivia discovered a strange woman standing next to her husband's bed. This woman was Mrs. Poppy, William Hill's wife. A woman who had been mentally ill and had passed away suddenly appeared there. With a gentle expression, Poppy led Olivia into the study and began to manipulate her. Poppy told Olivia that everything she saw was just a nightmare. Whether it was the body of her daughter or the headache, they were all merely Olivia's nightmares. And these nightmares might very well consume her children too. Following Poppy's instructions, Olivia turned around and found herself in her children's room. Looking at the children sleeping soundly, she finally began to believe Poppy's words. Then Poppy continued, claiming that the things the children had had mentioned about the twisted woman and the strange old man indicated they were being tormented by nightmares. Olivia wanted to free her children from these nightmares, and Poppy replied that the only way to do so was to pull the children out of the dream, and to wake up from the dream, they had to end their lives. While Olivia was still struggling with this thought, the scene suddenly shifted again. She discovered that she was holding a sharp nail pointed at her husband's neck. Hugh realized that his wife was unstable and suggested that Olivia go out to relax for a while. Since she was already very tense, she immediately agreed. But that very night, when Olivia was putting her youngest daughter to bed, Nell asked a question. If Nell often saw the twisted woman, would Olivia save her from that woman? Looking at her daughter's innocent face, Olivia seemed to make a decision. She firmly told her daughter that she would protect her no matter what. However, a voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts and brought her back to reality. When she turned around, she saw her son, Stephen. At that moment, the surroundings had turned to daylight, and there was no sign of her youngest daughter on the bed. Noticing that his mother seemed uneasy, Stephen gave her a vanity table as a gift. Olivia, who was already feeling quite happy, looked into the mirror but was horrified to see the images of her two deceased children. Terrified, Olivia smashed the mirror. Her mental state deteriorated further, and she became completely manipulated by Poppy. One night, she woke up the children, who were sound asleep, and led them upstairs to hold a tea party. When she opened the door, Olivia discovered a little girl lying asleep on Luke's bed. It was Abigail, the little girl Luke had seen outside the villa. However, this did not stop Olivia. At that moment, she was determined to wake up her children. So, Olivia put poison into the tea. The children had no suspicion, and Abigail calmly drank her cup of tea. Shortly after, the girl began foaming at the mouth. When Olivia's other children were about to drink, Hugh managed to rush in and stop them. Just a moment later, his children could have died from poisoning. Furious, Hugh pushed his wife to the ground. Then he took the children to the car and left. When Olivia woke up, she started searching for her children. As Olivia turned the doorknob, Poppy continued to manipulate her. She told Olivia to kill Hugh as well. While Olivia hesitated, a voice from behind, that of an elderly woman lying in bed, called out to her. The woman kept telling Olivia that Poppy was a liar and that she should never trust Poppy. As Olivia was still undecided, her husband had already taken their son Stephen to the car. Olivia could only stand by the window, watching the car drive away. At that point, Olivia completely broke down. She could no longer distinguish what was real and what was not. Olivia stood alone by the stair railing, repeatedly calling out, wanting to wake up. Poppy, standing behind her, continued to tempt Olivia. Finally, she closed her eyes without hesitation and jumped down. Back in the present, Stephen and his father were following Luke's trail to the villa. As soon as they entered, they smelled the strong scent of gasoline. Hugh immediately confirmed that his son must have been there. He hurriedly led Stephen to the red door. When Stephen turned around, he saw a figure about 3 meters tall standing in the hallway. In a panic, Stephen quickly moved forward. Looking up, he discovered the dead girl, Abigail, sitting on the stairs, staring at them. Hugh immediately called to Stephen to look at him, which allowed them to escape danger. They quickly ran upstairs. Hugh knocked hard on the red door, but it would not open. Just as he turned to find something to break down the door, Stephen noticed that the door opened on its own, and Luke was lying inside, crying for help. In the next moment, Poppy appeared before Stephen, and in the blink of an eye, she made him return to his home. At that moment, Stephen's wife was pregnant, and everything seemed as though it had never happened. His life was back on track. Stephen even considered continuing to write a novel about the events that had occurred. But when he reached the part about entering the red door, he could not remember what happened after that. As he tried to recall, his wife began to change. Her pregnant belly started showing stretch marks, and dark spots began appearing on it. At that moment, Nell suddenly appeared. She gently touched Stephen's head, and he suddenly woke up from the hallucination. Beside him, Luke was dying, foam coming from his mouth, while Stephen was trapped inside. Hugh, on the outside, was also affected. His body was covered in mold, causing him to lose consciousness. At this point, Shirley and Theodora finally arrived, but the fates of Stephen and Luke seemed sealed, and they were unlikely to escape a tragic death. When Theodora ran upstairs, she discovered that her father had fainted. As she was about to turn back to find her sister, Poppy suddenly appeared and attacked her. Meanwhile, Shirley downstairs was caught in a terrifying hallucination of a memory. It turned out that Shirley had an affair with someone at a conference. This was a guilty secret she could never shake, but she knew she would eventually have to face it. Then the scene changed. Shirley found herself at her own funeral. Her husband was standing beside her, telling everyone that Shirley died early because she had a secret she feared he would discover. Then Shirley saw her own corpse sit up and begin scratching at her face until it was disfigured. As she was about to break down completely, her youngest sister appeared and pulled Shirley out of the illusion. On the other side, Theodora was also trapped in a hallucination. In the past, due to her abilities, she always avoided touching others, but the nightmare transformed into countless black hands trying to completely submerge Theodora. As she was about to give up, Nell appeared once more and helped her wake from the dream. But the first scene that appeared before Theodora was Stephen and Shirley trying to save their younger brother from the hands of death. When all three of them thought that Luke had died, in reality, he was still trapped in an illusion. In that illusion, Luke saw his mother joyfully welcoming him back to consciousness and even preparing a hat hat for him to wear. As he was about to step forward, his youngest sister warned Luke to run, and those words brought him back to his senses. At the same time, Nell appeared next to Luke and helped him return to reality. When all four of them finally woke up, Nell appeared before them. She told them that this room had always been a trap for everyone. They had all fallen into an illusion. It was Steven's entertainment room, Shirley's family living room, Theodora's dance room, Luke's wooden house, and Nell's playroom, which was also their mother's study. At that moment, they realized that Nell, like an angel, had been constantly trying to save them from the illusions. Meanwhile, outside, Hugh finally regained consciousness. He shakily took a pill and swallowed it. At that moment, Poppy appeared before him, just like she had seduced Olivia. But this time, Hugh's wife appeared and chased Poppy away. Since Olivia remained trapped in her own dream and could not escape, she wanted to keep their children forever in that room. Olivia thought that this was the only way to protect her children, but Hugh rejected her approach, telling her that their children had grown up and could not live forever under their parents' protection. They needed to grow, and what parents should do is let go, allowing their children to spread their wings and soar when they came of age. After hearing this, Olivia finally decided not to bind her children anymore. Hugh opened the red door, and then everyone helped Luke back to the car and took him to the hospital. Before they left, Hugh called Steven back to the mansion. There, Hugh revealed the truth about the past. It turned out that after leaving the hotel, he had returned to the mansion once more, but it was too late. Olivia had died in a pool of blood after falling from a height. At that moment, the maid and the gardener arrived at the mansion because their daughter had sneaked out of the house at midnight. It turned out the poisoned girl, Abigail, was their daughter. Seeing the gardener holding his daughter's lifeless body and crying bitterly, Hugh was both sorrowful and angry. He intended to burn the mansion down, but the gardener stopped him. They knew that all of this had been caused by the mansion, but at that moment, the couple could only look at their daughter's spirit inside. They didn't want to be separated from their daughter, so they hoped Hugh would keep the mansion, and the gardener and his wife promised to keep the secret of what had happened that day. After much consideration, Hugh agreed to conceal the truth to protect his children's childhood. After Steven learned the truth from Hugh, he finally understood the deep pain his father had kept hidden for all these years. In the past, Steven couldn't understand why Hugh had stayed silent until this moment. Looking at his father, collapsed on the ground with pills scattered everywhere, he finally understood that sometimes silence was the truest form of love. It turned out that Steven's father had taken the pills in exchange for his life to open the red door for his children. Finally, Hugh stood before the red door, bidding his final farewell to Steven. He expressed his gratitude and said that the greatest happiness of his life was being a father to his children. Hugh had spent his entire life opening the red door, just so his children could grow up healthy and strong. Now that everything had come to an end, he could finally embrace his children and his beloved wife. The red door slowly closed. When Steven stepped out of the mansion, he saw all the spirits within the old house. But now, Steven was no longer afraid, because love could drive away all fear. After all the storms and trials faced by Hugh's family, 2 years later, Luke had successfully overcome his addiction and celebrated his progress. Everyone in the family sent their congratulations to the younger brother. Meanwhile, Theodora moved out of Shirley's house and lived happily with her love. Steven also bravely reconciled with his wife and welcomed their own child. In the end, the gardener and his wife returned to the old mansion. In their final moments, they passed away at the mansion, and their spirits were happily reunited with their 2 children. Hill Mansion remained there, looking strange, but it held the eternal love of many, a love that would never change with time.